Sorry. I still can't read it. When the lights go down, I could see Ready?
I'm ready.
All right, folks, if everyone can maybe find a seat, we'll get started. And on behalf of the Smithland Regional Library and the Smith County Genealogical Society, we want to welcome you here today. We are very excited to have Dr. Jim Glanville back with us. Many of you know Jim because he's been doing some of this work for several years, and I have worked with him in the Virginia DAR. But if you don't know Jim, I want to give you just a little bit of background. Now, for somebody from the DAR to be just crazy about someone who was born in London, it's a little bit of a stretch. But Jim was born in London, England, and he graduated from the Royal College of Science in South Kensington, London, with a degree in chemistry. He studied at the University of Maryland and was awarded a PhD in chemistry. He's had a long career in education that finally brought him to Virginia Tech, where he worked as the Director of General Chemistry. Now, after retirement, he took up a second career as an independent scholar of history and archaeology, focusing on prehistory and the prehistory of Southwest Virginia. And that's when he came to know all of us in Smith County and surrounding area, because he has uncovered some things that many of us, many historians, did not know about Southwest Virginia. So I'm not going to give a long introduction because I know you want to hear Jim. But just to say, he's married to Dina Flincham, a native of Wytheville, and they live in Blacksburg. So Jim, we're very happy to have you back and to have you talking about ancient Holstonia. So
Thank you. Pat, thank you for that kind introduction. It's really nice to be back, and I'm going to say today I've got a lot of friends in the room, so if you need to interrupt me and holler, and if I'm not being clear, just let me know and I'll back up and make myself clear. I've got a story today that covers 1,200 years, give or take, and 2,000 miles. And here is the very heart of it. It's the story of the Yuchi people, who are a most remarkable American Indian tribe. And they were here for many, many years. Their story is a long and a tortured one, and I'll tell you the story from the very beginning, as best we can understand it, till very recently, and it's quite an interesting story very recently. So that's my overall talk. But today I wanted to dedicate my remarks to two very good friends of mine who are no longer with us. The first is Lawrence Richardson of Adwolf, who I suspect many of you in the room know, who was a avocational archaeologist and was the first person in Virginia to understand the significance of the Yuchi tribe of Indians. He was the very first. Second person was Charlie Bill Totten, again, somebody who many of you know, who was for many years involved with the town of Sauville, was tourism director, and so on. So here's a picture of Lawrence doing what he loved to do best, digging in a hole at the Fox site, which is up near a 7-mile fort. This is from now almost 40 years ago. And there's a picture of Charlie and Bill Totten, like me, huffing and puffing with the Yuchi tribe of Indians, climbing up to the Palmer Spring one day back in 2009. So I fondly think of both of these gentlemen, and they're in my thoughts frequently. What I'm going to do today, here's what I'm going to talk about in outline. I'm going to tell you about the archaeological record of Southwest Virginia, which is essentially unknown. Really needs to be much better known, and that's what brought me into the subject, the realization that there's a remarkable American Indian archaeological record around here. Secondly, I'll talk about the neglect and why that record has been so badly neglected. And then, Virginia history begins, I can't tell you it begins exactly in Smith County, it probably begins in Washington County, but the earliest European contact that we can really record is out here in Western Virginia. This comes as a great shock to all kinds of people, especially people in Richmond and in Charlottesville, who don't understand this at all. But I'll tell you a little bit about this. And the Spaniards were in Saltville in 1567. That's 1567, which is what? 4 decades before those late-coming Englishmen arrived in Jamestown. Go back one. And then I'll talk about this 1,200-year saga of the Yuchi Indians. The name gets spelled both ways. And finally, in the last few minutes, I'm going to talk about modern genealogy and how you can go about contacting people to talk about American Indian roots. Now, fortunately, in the last few years, we've seen a lot of useful scholarship going on in this general area. So on the left, the book came out, published by Jason Bed Jackson, Yuchi Indian Histories. That's a very useful set of essays, but it begins after our period. It doesn't really begin until after our period. The middle book is by a fellow called Robin Beck, who's the principal archaeologist at the Berry site. I'm going to be saying a lot about the Berry site, which is in Morganton, North Carolina, where there is an absolutely unambiguous, well-documented Spanish fort from 1566. That's in North Carolina, and he's the author of that book. And the third word there in the title, coalescence. The American Indian societies, after the arrival of the Europeans, the traditional societies, which were big and important and strong, went into a terrible period of flux and change, and ultimately coalesced, many of them, and the modern 5 civilized tribes, quote, quote, that we speak of today, were a result of that coalescence. And finally, this book just came out. I got my copy about 5 weeks ago. It's edited by Robin Beck, and it's a set of essays about the Berry site. And this place, Juala, is at Morganton in North Carolina. And I myself have contributed a lot to this scholarship because I've published about this map, and actually I'm the first person to really interpret this map in modern terms, and I'll tell you about that later on. So finally, and as I said, the last thing is I'll talk about genealogy. So that's where I'm going. I call it Hostonia, and it's basically the watershed of the 3 forks of the Holston River. I call that Hostonia. A little bit goes down into Tennessee, but that's just a convenient name for this region. And the question is, who were these Holstonians? And they were Yuchi people. I'm quite convinced now. How did I get into this? Well, before the arrival of the Europeans, we can only know the American past through the objects that those American Indians left. And they left around here especially a very rich record of Native American artifacts, and I'll show some of them shortly. Actually, in the so-called medieval period, to pick up a European term, North America had a very large central empire. This was a big, big country. Cahokia, which was the capital, was bigger than all the European cities except 2 around 1300. It's a kind of a European prejudice. We think down about the Indians. They couldn't have been really important people. But in fact, there were vast empires in North America before the Europeans ever got here. It's given various names, but the Mississippian cultural area is one name. Here's a, it runs, as I said, from about 800 to about 1500, and it was the period of the mound building. And perhaps some of you recall the prejudice was in the 19th century that American Indians couldn't possibly have built mounds. And so American historians and archaeologists created this mythical society called the Mound Builders, who were the people who were no longer here but built the mounds because the Indians couldn't possibly have built them. But of course the mounds were built by Indians, and they were very complex and sophisticated societies. And it's only in the last 5 years really that historians have begun to think to make comments like, you know, we shouldn't think about American edges. We should think about the American Indian Empire, which was here before the Europeans ever arrived. And there's actually quite an interesting cultural change. Here's what Mississippi looks like on the map. This is a map from Herb Rowe. It's a Wikipedia map. And each one of these little green quadrupeds or quadrilaterals is a mound. And you can imagine the Mississippi River coming down from the Great Lakes and then exiting in the Gulf. And that's basically the Mississippi watershed. And of course, we're out here. You notice where we are under this big question mark. And I'm going to change that case today. I'm going to argue that we're fully, this region is fully part of Mississippian America. It's just simply that that has not been recognized yet. So it's broken up, divided up into various regions. We're technically in southern Appalachian, Mississippi. It stops, though. The archaeologists have for 50 years stopped it. If I can point out where this map is just taken from Marvin Smith's paper in 1989, and if I can find my, I very cleverly have hidden my, there it is, given my pointer. Now you can see the orientation. You see this is the corner of Tennessee. So here's Austin Springs. So Bristol is about here. So that's where we are. And it stops. And it stops because we don't have mounds. But what we do have, which is in many ways, and I'll come back and talk about this, anybody guess? Where did religion go as the Indians moved up into this area? They didn't have enough bottomland, they didn't build mounds, but they went down into caves. That was what I was going to talk to your husband about, the geology around here. And this is karst country, and much of the material that's found, has been found, comes from the caves. So this is where it stops. Now, this is Mike Barber writing 15 years ago, and Mike Barber is currently the Virginia State Archaeologist. I'll read you this. Areas of Smith and Washington counties, Virginia, have long been known for the recovery of abundant exotic goods during the late woodland period. That's Mississippian. We have so many other things. Virginia, we have to do things our own way. He means Mississippi. These include conch shell gorgets, and Carol has got, not a real one, but Carol's got an imitation, a reproduction conch shell gorget, which I'm going to ask her to pass around so you can look at it. It's actually not made on marine shell, the ones coming around. It's actually made on abalone shell, I think. But it will give you an idea of the kind of high art object that these people were able to create. Copper discs, copper beads, funerary pots, all kinds of funerary pots. Lots of people. How many people know people who had funerary pots? I know one person in the audience does. How many of you remember Dixie Lee and B.B. Huff? Yeah, they had a very fine pot. Here's what Bobby goes on to say. He says, the presence of these Mississippian origin artifacts in an isolated area of Virginia, you see how these Richmonders think of us, right? In an isolated area of Virginia, has caused some consternation. Well, it shouldn't cause any consternation at all. The problem is with the attitudes of the people who are saying this. And they said, perhaps it was the salt from Saltville that made it the center, and that may very well be the case. Here's some of the stuff. All of this on the top shelf are shell objects. These are all gorgets. These are all gorgets. Shell gorgets, engraved items. There are probably 1,000 which came out of Smith and Washington counties together. I've probably seen 600 of them. Perhaps 20 are known in the professional literature. This is a place called Space Farms. It's literally a farm, a zoo, and it was run by a guy called Ralph Space, who was kind of a 1930s version of Tony Soprano. and he ran, they're about 60 miles northwest of New York City, and he ran the local fire company and figured out during Prohibition that he could ship booze in fire trucks to New York City and make a fortune. And as a kid, Ralph Space had found arrowheads. It's actually amazing. They're on the Appalachian Trail right up there in that top corner of New Jersey. And like so many folks of that type, became enamored of Indian artifacts, and the more money he got, the more Indian artifacts he bought. And he hooked up in 1931, and Cal, you sent me a clipping. There's a clipping that Lawrence had in his files saying that Ralph Space and Rufus Pickle, who lived just down the street here, down near the now the disused motel down there, that they were in Tennessee in 1931 looking at Indian collections. So we know they were together. So almost all of this stuff came from Ralph Space coming down. He came down over a series of summers to Smith County, and they dug up Indian graves. This is the kind of material which he took back. Yes, sir?
Isn't there some controversy about Rufus Pickle's collection in that, the Space Farm? About how a lot of the Rufus stuff wound up there?
The only controversy I'm aware of is that I have written that the deal that the two men had was that the collection would go to the one who survived. Whoever died first lost the collection. That's what I was told by the space people. But tell me if there's another controversy.
Possibly.
Okay.
I mean, I know very little about it.
Okay. But my point is, leaving that aside, my point is, this is from our area. This comes from our region. And this is not all that comes from our region. And you won't find, other than people like Mike Barber saying there's a lot of stuff in the area, you won't find any formal documentation. I put this in the archaeological bulletin, quarterly bulletin of the Archaeological Society of Virginia. So I published some of this. Next one. Now you're going to know something about these. I'm not going to tell you about this one on the right. This is a fella in Saltville. That's a private collection. I've seen dozens of these kinds of collections. The amount of stuff around here is amazing. And I want to know if anybody in the room knows the owner of the one on the left. It took me 7 years to track that down. This is Fred Space's collection. Excuse me, I didn't mean that at all. I meant that this is the collection of oh my gosh, I've got a senior moment here. I should have got a slide. He owned the Broad Street Tea Room. Black man. Fred Sharp. Not Fred Space, Fred Sharp. This is the Fred Sharp. Isn't that amazing? This is Fred Sharp's collection. And it's now with his family. And it took me 6 or 7 years. It's in Tidewater now. 6 or 7 years to find it. So there's just an abundance of this kind of material. And I could show you 30 slides like this. I mean, there's just a huge abundance of this kind of material. But it's all in private collections. It was never formally dug in archaeological investigations. This is a typical place. It's a place where I've seen and photographed wrecks. Some of you recognize this. Who's the guy who owns this dairy farm down here? This used to be the site of the B.B. Huff International Airport, down below Chilhowie on the river.
Dave Johnson.
Dave Johnson now is the dairy farmer who owns this, and so I was there, and Lawrence Richardson, where I were there a number of times together. This is also near the famous Ebbing Spring. Yeah, and I actually, just once I saw the Ebbing Spring flow down there. There's a lot of other places. This is where William Campbell killed the Tory, who was probably a horse thief. So there's a lot of history in Smith County. So, why was Southwest Virginia so neglected? No mounds, and mounds, American archaeologists got in the habit of thinking where the mounds were, there was archaeology, and since we don't have any mounds in Smith County, we didn't get archaeologists. There was no big federal archaeology in the 30s and the 40s. There was a lot of TVA and WPA sponsored archaeology. So we had a lot of archaeology downriver, but it never got up into Washington, Smith County. And we didn't have, archaeology is a strange profession. We have big men, dominant features, dominant figures in the profession. And Virginia never got one of those, like Jeffrey Coe or Funkhouse or some of the guys in other states. And of course, Virginia history traditionally looks eastward towards Jamestown. So out here, we're what? We're not only Hostonia, we're Forgotonia. and one local Marion former newspaper man, who some of you know, I think over here it's going. Yeah. Do you need it? No. Okay. And we have the hillbilly factor. but we get looked down on, and we should get looked up to for this stuff. All right, lots of caves, hundreds of caves in Smith and Washington counties, and lots of springs, which is consequent because we have all the karst, all the limestone country. So how many of you got springs on property? You know where springs are. So lots of hands up around the room. And most of them were Indian mortuaries. The American Indians buried people in there. I've got lots of high-level reports of that. Most were vandalized. Why? Because in the 20s and the 30s, nobody worried about Indians. And if you dug up a few of their graves and got stuff you could sell, that was all to the good. So I've often said that Saltville had 3 mining industries. They mined a lot of limestone, they mined a lot of salt, but also they mined a lot of dead Indians. It's just an amazing story. So the religion went underground, and this only came to me later. When I first wrote about this 10, 11 years ago, it didn't occur to me that this was what was going on. So here's, in summary, this is some of the evidence. The evidence of the pots and the pipes and the gorgets. The buildings, many of the excavated buildings were partially underground. Rufus Pickle has documented that. Rufus Pickle actually published a number of useful papers, and this is characteristic of Yuchi people. Charles Hudson, who's now dead, who was a premier southeastern Indian anthropologist, said not only were the Yuchi in Holstonia, but they spoke Yuchi. Raymond Evans says that an Indian woman, I'm going to tell you about the first princess of Virginia, the first princess of Virginia who wasn't Pocahontas, and who she gave himself though, and she was a Yuchi. And there's been a recent report from ETSU which says the Holliston Mill site, which is in Church Hill on 11W, I can't get them all straight, but it's in Church Hill, was a Yuchi site. Next one. No, it's me to do it. Okay. So I argue that they were Yuchi people, these Holstonians, who likely originated in the heart of Mississippian America, in modern-day Illinois at Cahokia. They were in central Tennessee by about 1400. They were in eastern Tennessee by about 1500. And they were here in our region for at least 200 years, maybe more. And this is the period when they produced much of this artwork that I've shown you. And they were, by the 1700s, they were totally scattered throughout the southeast, except that always as they moved, they tended to leave small groups behind. And that's true, I'm going to argue, today. And Chief Lee is here as evidence of that. By 1840, we had the experience of that wonderful president who's going to go on the back of the $20 bill, and the Andrew Jackson and the Great Indian Removal. And so the vast majority of the Yuchi were gone to Oklahoma. I'll show you pictures of them some later on. So the deep Yuchi, they began at Cahokia, came out of the Nashville Basin. They settled in the Great Valley of East Tennessee, all the way from here to Alabama. And this is from Wok Taylor. Wok Taylor couldn't be here today. I'll show you his picture later on. Wok Taylor lives in Oak Ridge, and he actually speaks some Yuchi language, and he is he runs a website which is devoted to the Yuchi tribe. His grandmother was a Yuchi. He grew up with a Yuchi grandmother. And the oral tradition says that they came into the Savannah River Basin from the Caribbean. But that's the oral tradition, but Wok Taylor favors the historical interpretation that they came out, as do I, that they came out of Cahokia. So, the Yuchi language is absolutely central to this. The Yuchi language is remarkable. There's a woman, Dr. Mary Lynn, who wrote a PhD thesis about the Yuchi language, and she's a linguistic specialist. So I've got a number of weaknesses when I tell this story. One is that obviously I can't speak Yuchi. Well, that very few people can. But this is what Mary Lynn writes. With innovative research and a stronger case for a linguistic genetic relationship with some other North American Indian language may someday be possible. She's writing down 4 years ago, 2012. But until then, Yuchi is a genetic isolate. It's a genetic license. She estimates, argues it well. I can read the paper, but I can't follow all the details of the argument. But Mary Lynn argues that the last time Yuchi shared a relationship with another language was, look at that number, 6,000 years ago. Now, you know, linguists are very clever at this kind of stuff. There was just a news report within the last 2 or 3 weeks that everyone in Europe spoke the same language in Belgium 19,000 years ago. So there's a, you know, a real science and a real art to understanding these linguistics. So we've got a group of people who today probably number fewer than 1,500, who probably never numbered 20,000, who've retained this language from 6,000 years ago to a handful of people. I'll show you that picture, to a handful of people today in Oklahoma. That's just an amazing story. I said at the beginning I was going to tell you about this over 1,200 years. I probably should have said I'm going to tell you this story over 6,000 years. So, everything's copacetic. We're doing our religion in caves. We're eating lots and lots of shellfish from the rivers. We've got nuts in the forest. We're killing plenty of deer. And boy, life is great. I would have loved to be in Buchanan in 1550. But into this wonderful world come Spaniards. There are 2 Spanish expeditions. First, 1539 to 1542, that's the gray one. That's De Soto. De Soto spends 3 years on a death march, going all the way, probably from Tampa, all the way to the Mississippi. He discovers, you know that language, he discovers the Mississippi, dies there. During that trip, he sends marauders north in search of gold. They find copper, and in 1539, I don't have the names written down, but we know their names, 2 Spaniards entered Virginia, and I asked the editor of the Richmond Times-Dispatch about a month ago, said, where were the first European feet in Virginia? And I said, think of the most unlikely place. And of course, they're in Lee County. So that's where the Virginians arrived first. And then there's, 30 years later, there's a series of movements into the center, led by a fellow called Juan Pardo, who's either a Spaniard or a Portuguese, depending on which writer you read. And the reason that Pardo's in here is because the Spanish were bringing the treasure from South America up out of the Gulf on the Gulf Stream, and the English and the French were stealing all their treasure. So the Spaniards didn't have a very good understanding of North American geography, and they thought that Mexico City and the mines were probably somewhere near Knoxville. And they figured that they could run pack horse trains from the coast, and that way they could unzip the schedule of the treasure fleets and avoid the pirates. That was the plan. So that's what Spaniards are doing in North Carolina. And what happened here at this site, which is the buried site in Morganton, beginning about 1995, that site was discovered, and now it's been the scene of a huge project. They spent $1.5 million of research money. It's just absolutely unambiguous. It's called Fort San Juan or Juala or various other names. So, just want to point out, Saltville is really early. It's from the buried site from Morganton that we have records that the Spanish come north to Saltville. And it only takes 75 years from first landing at San Salvador for Spaniards to be in Saltville, which I think is an amazing number. And of course the Englishmen aren't anywhere in sight at this point. It's tough. Not only do I can't understand the Yuchi language, I can't understand 16th century Spanish. So you need to be a specialist in this kind of stuff to understand the implications of the argument. The archives in Seville in Spain are full of this kind of stuff. And I'm fortunate I know 2 or 3 of the people who are expert on this, but I have to believe what I say. This is a 1584 document from a fellow called Domingo de Leon. This was finally published. Remember I showed you those 3 books in front, the right-hand book? This was finally published just 2 months ago. Fortunately, the author, 12 years ago, the author sent me a copy, so I was able to write my first article using a copy from the author. But it wasn't published finally until this year. And if you look, there's an arrow there, and Domingo de Leon says to the king, he says, I'm an old soldier, I was a good fighter for you, you need to give me a pension, I'm an old geezer living here in Spain. And to prove it, I did all kinds of good work for you, including that I went with Alferez Moyano, Hernando Moyano, and I attacked these towns called Maniatique and Guapere. And the interpretation of Maniatique is Saltville. So here we've got a Spaniard writing in his pension application that he was in Saga. This is just from National Geographic, and I put this in for kind of fun, but I always tell people, so here's Juan Pardo, and we've got Chief Lee in the room for us, so this is Juan Pardo negotiating with one of Chief Lee's predecessors somewhere in the upper Tennessee in 1566. One of the young American Indian women, a Yuchi I will argue, married a Spanish soldier. We don't know what her Indian name was, although I'll give you a guess later on, but her Spanish name was Luisa Menendez. And she gave testimony many years later in 1600, and there are documents, which again written in Spanish, which record this. And she married a Spanish soldier and moved all the way down to Florida to St. Augustine. She was a snowbird. And she came from a place where they made salt by certain methods using fire. In other words, there's one in the front lobby. It's a big modern steel one, but Saltville produces brine, which is salt dissolved in water, and if you want solid salt, you heat it up, the water is driven off, it concentrates, and then crystals of salt come down. And that was the way salt was made. Still made that way, but in big titanium vessels today for the plant that is making salt in Saltville. American Indians had no metal, so they made it in pots, which is one of the reasons. How many of you found pottery on farms and fields around here? Lots and lots of pottery. And one of the arguments I've made is that that's because American Indians were carrying brine to places near Saltville and boiling it to make brine. She was married 40 years before Pocahontas. Oh, and here's where I say this. I asked Watt Taylor, the historian, Yuchi historian, to give me a name for her in Yuchi. And he said, well, we'll take Louisa and we'll make him La Weisa, which means, in Yuchi, it means she dreams of good or powerful things, which seems like a pretty nice name for an American Indian princess from Smith County. That's where she was born, I say. And we have very little archaeological record. There was an incredible American Indian site right there. Some of you may remember when they scraped this, and all kinds of artifacts were found. And the best record, the best archaeological record I have, is a tape recording that Tom Totten made, a tape recording of Rufus Pickle, which I've got transcribed. That's our archaeological record of what was here. But Pickle describes a temple house being on this site. So, a little bit more about the Berry site, also called Juara, also called Fort San Juan, and this is in North Carolina. Discovered by accident, it's an ornamental plant farm, and Berry, the Berry family, were the aunt and uncle of Robin Beck, who became the archaeologist. Now he's a very famous, internationally lauded guy, gets invitations to Spain to go talk, so he's been a big success story. And those cheeky guys down there, thumbing their nose at Sir Walter Raleigh, they're calling now this inland site the first lost colony, not the one that was out on the sandbanks of North Carolina. And this is Robin Beck. I know all three of these guys. Robin Beck wrote the book, and David Moore was an archaeologist at Warren Wilson College, and Chris Rodney joined the team later. That's David, the straw hat up left. This is 2004, 2006. This is the Berry site, and I tell people, if you've been to one archaeological site, doesn't this looks like Lawrence's one we saw earlier. If you've seen one archaeological dig, you've seen them all. Yeah. The archaeologists get very snooty when I say that, but it really is true. You know, it's squares and earth and people with trowels and shovels and, you know, young people on their knees with toothbrushes. So that's the site. There's one of the nails down the bottom left, and really bad pun. I always tell people that these archaeologists, Beck and Rodney and Moore, they've really got this site nailed. It's really that they have now. There's no argument. You know, it makes National Geographic and New York Times, and it's a real thing. So from there, from the Berry site, it's become absolutely solidified. And in the summer of 1567, Orlando Moyano, acting independently, marched north through the mountains and attacked Maniatique and attacked Salta. And one of the Indian women there became the princess. I thought this was the end of the story, but I've got more to tell you. I'll come back to this in a minute. Now this is Robin Beck, so he's a big deal, okay? And in his book from 2 years ago, he says, archaeological evidence clearly indicates that the 15th and 16th century inhabitants of the Piedmont, the Carolina Piedmont, practiced a regional variant of Mississippian culture. And what he's arguing is that my people were not low-class farming people. We had true Mississippian culture here at the Berry site. And if he can say that, I can say that. You've seen the stuff now. I say that in spades. It isn't that big black question mark. We had just that same kind of regional variation of Mississippian culture right here. Up and down the Middle Fork is just amazing. It's just incredible, the amount of stuff. How do you remember the digging at the Chilhowie High School? Yeah, I mean, just an amazing story. Hundreds of Indian graves uncovered when they scraped the ground. Hundreds of people out on the weekend digging up Indians. Amazing the amount of stuff that came up there. So, Beck argues, this is interesting, this is a new thought from Beck. It's traditionally said that the population collapse was as a result of the European diseases. And that's probably true, but it comes much later, Beck argues. Beck argues that the collapse of the Mississippian world was fundamentally a transformation of political economy. The society changed from one built on corn, maize, to one built on guns and slaves and hides, deerskins. And his story takes us from the very first encounters through the 1700s. This is the publisher's book. So Beck challenges the traditional story that the Europeans in the early days brought disease. In fact, they didn't. The real collapse comes later with slaving. And I've told Chief Lee this. The Yuchi, it turns out, wound up becoming a slaving group. And that was one of the things when I came back from Oklahoma in 2010, I was a little bit uncomfortable. I didn't like to think that my favorite Indians were in the 17th and 18th century slavers. But more recently I've had good advice about why that had to happen, and I'll show you some of that later. I think it was an inevitable consequence at the time of the conditions in which they lived. This, by the way, as an afterthought, is Florida in 1570, and I just want to point out that this comes from Albert Manuse's map from his book about the first Florida governor, and you can see here's La Florida, and I think that A is right about Marion, Virginia. So remember that Virginia was Florida first before it was Virginia. That doesn't go down very well in Richmond either. So I thought I was all through, right? I did this 10 years ago, end of story. And then Wilma Smith, who lives in Bristol, and is one of my, I have lots of email correspondence, sent me an email said that she and her friend had been reading the Bristol newspapers, and they'd found a mention of DeSoto in 1869 in the Bristol newspapers. 2 previously unreported newspaper articles from those dates. I spent the next 6 hours online at the Library of Congress and found them. You know, we live in the internet age, and it took me a while to find them, but you know, by 3 a.m. the next morning, I had those clippings on my computer. And the first article describes the excavation of a Spanish soldier from a camp. The second one says, oh, he was probably from DeSoto. Of course, I knew immediately he was Pardo. He wasn't DeSoto, so because of where he was. So that got me started again. And it wasn't that the story is so important, but what it got me doing was thinking about the maps. Those are the 2 clips. A mysterious discovery, that's what it says on Iron Mountain, the opening of a sepulchre. And it says, my friends, we were sitting there, I was smoking my pipe in this canyon with beetling walls, and my eyes spied upon a cairn. And I said to my hunting buddies, go get a shovel, and we'll dig that up. And they dug it up. And they went down, and they found, I don't know how they knew of this, but they dug through American Indian people, and down the bottom they found a European who had weapons of war and was wearing a coin which said España on it. We looked hard for the coin, we thought we found it, but it turned out the one we finally found was a Roman coin, not a Spanish coin. So that got me started. This is now Google Map, obviously. There's Morganton, that's Barry, and there's Saltville, and you can see where we are, and that's where our best guess of the cairn is. So obviously the interpretation is that this is one of the guys who attacked Saltville in 1567, and he was either wounded at Saltville or he fell sick or broke his leg on the way home. He would have been left, the Spaniards wouldn't tarry time to bury him, but he was an honorable man, and the Indians would have buried him as in an important grave, as an important thing. That's all we have. All you know is speculate. Probably one Spanish soldier buried by Indians. The Indians built the cairns. The Spaniards could have hung around. And the implements of war suggest a high status Indian burial. They buried his weapons with him. So that made me think about maps. And I said, well, now we ought to be able to put all of this on a modern map. This is Ortelius's, the end of the world, first ever world atlas, 1570. Went through many, many editions. But the edition I was interested in is the third edition, which is 1584. And the 1584 Ortelius map published in Amsterdam shows this map of La Florida with all of these Indian towns up here. So I thought, boy, this is a great map, and we need to think about this a lot because this is key to our situation. So I won't go through the whole story, but it turns out this is actually two maps jammed together. This map down the bottom, from about here downwards, that's from De Soto. And the upper part is from Pardo. And they're totally out of whack. In other words, the top part is only about a third as wide as the bottom part. It's the same issue of geography. So I simply took off the top part, and I said, I'm going to use these Indian towns. I know enough archaeology to be able to place these Indian towns, and I know exactly where this one is, because this one is Yuala, and that's the bury site. And then I'm going to arrange all of those. So what I did was to took that portion, I overlaid it onto a Google map, and it shows Southwest Virginia, which matches the 9th Congressional District, and it got me invited, what I did with this map, got me invited to address the very prestigious Virginia Map Circle. I got to go to Williamsburg to talk to the Virginia Map Circle. So I got some guy's con that I actually did something clever. So there it is. So here you see, there's that, you got to get, that's that corner of Tennessee. And here's Saltville way up here at the top. And I'm always happy to tell people that we just got Roanoke and where I live in Blacksburg. And you see how it looks like the 9th Congressional District? So this is 1584. And of course I always tell people, what's not here is Jamestown and Richmond and Alexandria and a whole bunch of other less important Virginia places. So this is where Virginia really, really, really begins. So this is the very most recent map. This is just from 4 years ago. This is John Worth and Brent Riggs collaborating, and I actually had to, it's a pretty bad map the way they produced it, but what I had to do was to put on the state borders, so now you can see exactly where you are. And this comes from Worth's interpretation of the Spanish documents, and he puts the Yuchi down towards the end of Lee County and the Chisco right where we are. It's not clear to me, and I've read it 4 times now, and we'll read some more. Exactly, the Spanish refer to the Chisco and Yuchi as though they're 2 different groups, but I suspect that they both spoke the Yuchi language. This is just one of those mysteries. We need more documents to really solve it. But are they here? Yes, they're here. Are they here for 200 or 300 years? Yes, they're here in our region for a long period of time. So here's the saga of the Yuchi Indians. I'll go through this fairly quickly. The first English record comes from 1713 when they report a fight near present-day Cleveland, Tennessee, which is down towards the Georgia border. And that caused a further diaspora. They have left, the Yuchi Indians have probably left here around 1650, many of them. It's the slave trade which is involved. It was driven, the slave trade was driven by the English-speaking American colonists. The slave trade ballooned during the 17th and early 18th centuries, and the American Indian communities formed confederacies to shield themselves from slave raids. Diane Bossy says this extensive trade swept across the southeast leaving no Indian community untouched. By 1707, all southwestern Indians were either slave raiders or the targets of slave raiders. And the slaves, of course, went to the sugar plantations of the South and to the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. It's just an ugly story. There's nothing you can say about it except it's history. So, Brett Riggs, and this I read chiefly when I read this from Brett Riggs, made me feel better about my friends in the Yuchi Nation. The slave trade presented Indians with repugnant choices. Groups such as the Yuchis could either become well-equipped and militarily aggressive, or they suffered the same fate of tens of thousands of Indians who were shipped off to toil their lives away in the sugar plantations. Yuchis opted for survival, and as a small nation that cast a large and heavily armed shadow across the southeast. But in the fight at Chestowie in 1715, their strategy failed, and one Yuchi community reaped the whirlwind of the slave trade, which consumed some of its own. So I felt better when I read this explanation of what was happening. So after 1713, I won't go through all of these, I'll show you this on the map, but the Yuchis scattered. And we have a lot of Yuchi history, but it's all over the South. This is 1,200 years of Yuchi history, or Yuchi history since 1200. I've very cleverly lost my pointer again. There it is. Okay. So this is Cahokia, Illinois, Mound City, an incredible place. And they're probably there as long ago as 1100, 1200. They moved through the National Basin, and they spent 300 years in East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia. And then after the diaspora continues, they wind up all over the South in small communities. Fort Benning, there's a place called Yuchi Town. I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. They're on the North Carolina, the South Carolina, Georgia border. There's a group that winds up near St. Augustine, fighting the English with the Seminoles under Chief Yuchi Billy. There's another group which winds up in the Florida Panhandle, also fighting the English. So they're scattered throughout the South until Andrew Jackson. And they're all swept to Oklahoma. This is Brett Riggs' map. I won't spend any time on this, but we know a good deal more detail in the historic period. Once we get to the historic period, the English historic period, we know it. But there were people here all through that period, even after Chestowie. This is Thomas Walker, famous explorer, compatriot, rival of Thomas Jefferson. In the fork between the Holstons and the North River are 5 Indian houses built with logs, covered with bark, and there were an abundance of bones. And on the north side of the river are 4 Indian houses. This is what's the name of this place in Kingsport? Rotherwood Mansion? Rotherwood Mansion. This is where Rotherwood Mansion is. This is, Thomas Walker is the guy who allegedly discovered the Cumberland Gap in 1750. This is Yuchi Town, artist representation by Martin Pate. This is the U.S. Army now. This is in Georgia. And this, of course, was Andrew Jackson, when all of these tribes were swept to the west, but leaving always remnant groups of people, especially in the high mountain areas.
I got a question.
Sure.
What about the Cherokees in North Carolina, in Cherokee, North Carolina? How did they escape getting transported away?
They did the same thing. They fought very hard and hid in the mountains. And so the eastern band of Cherokees were all people who fought resistance and remained behind and finally re-emerged. John Swan, a famous ethologist, said in 1922 a few Yuchi are still living in Tennessee. And then again in 1946 he said it should be added that a few Yuchis never moved out of the Appalachians. Some of the Yuchis joined the Snowbird Cherokee. Some Cherokee joined the Yuchis. I'll show you evidence of that in just a second. So, this is the Tennessee Encyclopedia. After removal, a few Yuchis remain in East Tennessee as late as 1918. I'll make that 2016, but that's the case now. This is my favorite piece of evidence, and you folks in the room today are really privileged because Chief Lee brought with him today to show you the 1857 Yuchi tribal roll. Now we're talking 20 years after removal. And so American Indians meet in Greene County, chiefly, where do we meet? Carter County. In Carter County. In Roan Mountain in Carter County, and they come together, and several hundred American Indians are involved, and they make a tribal roll. And I want to read to you what the front page says. This is the colophon in the front page of the Yuchi tribal roll, which is with us today. On this day, the Creator has brought and seen fit that we come together as the Appalachian people. And you notice at the very beginning I said you've got to remember coalescence, that the one effect of the Europeans was always to cause disruption in Indian societies, which then coalesced. They came together as the Appalachian people from many tribes, the Monacan, Saponi, Yuchi, Tudelo, Cherokee, Shawnee, and now we gather as one. And we ask you, Creator, to protect and deliver us from the dark evil that tracks us. And you're all invited to consider what was the dark evil that was tracking the American Indians in East Tennessee in 1857. You know, what was it Pogo said? We say that it was us. Yeah. So this is for me one of the other powerful pieces of evidence, but this is one powerful piece of evidence that the Yuchi Indians and other Indians remained here. Sam Barnes, who couldn't be here today, Sam Barnes is a member of the remnant Yuchi Nation. His grandmother, with those dates, lived to be 93 years old. He knew her for the first 30 years of his life. She grew up in Hancock County and lived most of her life in Smoke Lake, which is apparently a little community near Gate City in Virginia. And Sam heard her speak to her children many times, speaking Yuchi. But outside the family, she didn't want any of the children to speak Indian. She didn't want other people to know that they were Indian, for all of the traditional reasons of prejudice. So, just a little bit about geology in modern times. This is just March this year, so there you see Chief Lee, who is there, who's here today with us, and on the right, in the red ribbon shirt, that's Wack Taylor, the Yuchi historian who I've frequently quoted and commented on today. And the lady in the middle is Cynthia Henderson, who's a black Yuchi. She's a professor of dance and drama at an upstate New York university, and she found Wack Taylor through the Yuchi website, and she came back to do genealogy on her Yuchi roots with the remnant Yuchi nation of Virginia and Tennessee. And on the left is Cindy Vest. These are, this is from 5 years ago from Laurel Run Park down below Kingsport. This is members of the remnant Yuchi nation drumming. And these are the clan mothers of the remnant Yuchi nation. And they met my wife one time, and they said to my wife, they took my wife aside, and they said, if that man of yours ever gives you any trouble, you just come and talk to us, we'll take care of him. So I have very special affiliation with the ladies. There's their logo, and here's Oklahoma. I was in Oklahoma about 6 years ago. There are, I think, in 2010, there were 5 or 6 living Yuchi speakers, and these are 3 of them, and I think we're down to 3 now. And Josephine Bigler, who's the one on the right, she said, just as we've heard in the East, that her grandmother insisted that she speak it at home, but she was not supposed to speak Yuchi outside of the house. This is the 3 finalists for the title of Miss Yuchi in Oklahoma. I was there in Oklahoma and had the pleasure to be there, the first ever Miss Yuchi event. And here are Indian royalty. These are all kinds of Miss Older Yuchi and Miss Grandma Yuchi, and there are all kinds of Yuchi tribes. And what I say is that these are the first Yuchi princesses since Saltville and Louisa Menendez in 1567. And this is one of the great events of my life. I was out there in Kellyville, and they did a stump dance, And I went and sought permission from the chief and the owners, and they said, you can join us the third time we do the dance. So I actually did a couple of circles in the stone dance in Kellyville, Oklahoma. And Jason Van Jackson is also, I tried to pick him out last night, but I can't pick him out anymore. And this is another story. This is Elder Perry Ramsey, who lived to be, he became one about the age of 76, and he finally came out as an American Indian. He didn't realize until very late in life that he had American Indian roots, and now he's a respected elder in the remnant Yuchi Nation of Kingsville. So Walt Taylor says, it's been of much interest, this is the Yuchi historian, in establishing Yuchi heritage. I get several requests every week from people who want to establish a Yuchi heritage, but the records are sparse and sketchy at best. Many families like Perry Ramsey, actively striven to conceal Indian heritage under the racial pressures of American apartheid. That's Walt Taylor speaking, and I agree with him. And then there are other issues of poverty and illiteracy and record keeping. So it's very, very tough. This is an email message several years ago from Walt Taylor to me. And of course, have you ever heard of Walter Plecker? Walter Plecker was the Virginia registrar in 1924, a physician, and he made it his purpose. He said there are only two races in Virginia. You can either be black or white, and your birth certificate should reflect that. And he essentially administratively extirpated Virginia Indian people. It's just a ghastly story. And we had a 1924 Racial Integrity Act passed, which made that Virginia law. So we have a very, very painful history here in Virginia. So that adds to this problem. So it's very tough. So Chief Lee's here. You can talk to him today. That's his, we'll put these back up in a minute. That's his email address, and that's his phone number. There's Walt Taylor. David Hackett is his English name. His phone number is there, and that's his email address. And Walt Taylor is very, very helpful also trying to help people. So thank you for your attention. And I didn't talk too long. Now, if we have time, I'll be happy to take questions. Yeah, here first.
The things you call the round platters, what were they used for? It looked like
The gorgets?
Yeah, gorgets.
The gorgets were ceremonial, and the Indian practice was to bury important figures in the society, the priests or the leaders, perhaps the priest leaders combined, that when they were buried, they would be buried with their ritual symbols of authority or power. And so these gorgets come from burials, and they're typically on the throat or the chest. A lot of them, it's an interesting story. There were also a lot of children who apparently had power and authority, because many of the gorgets are on the graves of children. It's a story that we don't quite understand how to reconstruct and fit it. So my interest is less in exactly understanding the story. My interest is that there is just so much material. We are Mississippian here. There was a large number of people in a well-advanced, literate, and not language literate, but artistically literate society.
Have you heard a story that used to go around about, I don't know if it was a pot hunter or it certainly wasn't an archaeological dig, but somebody discovered a Spanish artifact or two in Saltwater?
I hear that a lot, and I've got a long-standing, anybody who hears about it, call me and I'll be there as fast as my car can take me there. I thought we had something from near Emory and Henry. I can't think of the gentleman's name there, but I think in a minute. And he said, we've got a Spanish sword right here in Emory and Henry, whatever the town is.
It wasn't Bartlett, was it?
No, it's, send me an email, I can tell you, it's gone from up here. But he lives right across the Emory and Henry campus. So I jumped in the car and went on down. And there's this remarkable blade. He's got a blade. And he lives in Glade Spring. So the article was published about 7 or 8 years ago. It's called The Blade from Glade. It's online, you can find it. Okay? And I went home really excited, you know. I've got the whole Virginia Tech library, and I'm getting this blade, right? And finally I got a nice guy in Oregon or somewhere, you know, via the web, who's the editor of the Antique Blade Students Club Association, you know. So I got the best blade guy, and he sends back an email and says, does it look like this? And I said, yes, it does. He says, what you've got is an African blade, and it's a sub-Saharan African blade from probably the 19th century. And what we think was there was some World War I Abingdon Army officer who picked it up in London and brought it back, and it got stuck into a tree, and they found it by burning logs, and this knife fell out of the tree. So I really love to find something. The closest is this coin from the Conquista. That's the closest we've come. But we can't find the site anymore, because where the cairn was, sadly, the Job Corps, we think in that canyon, the Job Corps practiced heavy equipment training for drivers. So we think that the cairn is long gone. We found it. There's an 1890 map of cairns in Tennessee, and we found it on the map, but we don't think the cairn can be found on the ground anymore.
Thank you.
Any more? Yes,
I was in Lee County, there's 5 Indian burial mounds that I know about, and there's over 100 Indian burial caves in Lee County.
Yeah, and that's the one area, the archaeologist, Dr. Maureen Myers, she wrote a PhD thesis about that, and there is some serious discussion of what's going on in Lee County, but it doesn't extend this far east. And one of the things I was amazed, you know, when you get to Abingdon, to get to Cumberland Gap, you still got 140 miles or something to get to the Cumberland Gap from Abingdon. You know, first time I did that.
You said that there's only like 3 people that speak the Yuchi language still?
3 living people, and they're all over 90.
So the Yuchi remnant, is there any desire for them to learn the language, or?
There's a big project in Sapulpa. The tribes are Kellyville and Sapulpa, and I forget the third one. But there are 3 towns. They're all about 20 miles from Tulsa. So they're up in the northwest corner, northeast corner of Oklahoma. And there's a fellow called Richard Grounds who's made it his business to start a Yuchi language project. So there's a real effort to teach some of the young people Yuchi. But the fact of the matter, just my opinion now, the fact of the matter is you can't really teach a living language in that way. You know, you can keep some knowledge of the language, but you really can't train new speakers at this stage. So it's after 6,000 years we're going to lose it, which is just very sad.
You know, talking about some of the digs in Southwest Virginia. Years ago, I was a charter member of the Archaeological side, the Wolf Hills chapter.
Right.
And we did the Anderson site, the Sullen site, the Crab Orchard site.
Right.
And all. Now, I know some of the things, the artifacts, but did a lot of that stuff wind up at the museum in Richmond and just stored back? Or is there any way that we could, my question is there any way we could get it back to Southwest Virginia? Because, I mean, we came up with some interesting artifacts. We mapped one village, it's Palisade Village, just off Route 75 there, going out of Abingdon.
I'm not popular with the professional archaeologists.
You and Bartlett obviously wasn't friends.
I know it, but
Yeah.
there was a book published 3 or 4 years ago with the title which I can't recall right now, Finders Keepers. So you're commended, a book called Finders Keepers. And it's a book written by a character, a guy who was himself a character. And he addresses the question of all the stuff which is stored away in archives.
You know, if I had it do over, I think some of the stuff I found would still be in here in Southwest Virginia instead of like an idiot turning it over to the powers of Richmond.
I understand that sentiment very well. The other side of that coin is that the professional archaeologists will not give any credit to materials which is held in private.
But most of the discovery's been done by amateur archaeologists.
You're preaching to the choir. I understand about this, but the problem is, how do you get this? How do I tell this story? Because the professional archaeologists are not happy with this. So when I wrote the book, when I wrote the review of this book, Finders Keepers, the final sentence was, this reviewer reaches the conclusion that archaeology is far too important to be left to the archaeologists.
I like that.
So that remains my opinion. Yeah, I mean, what they do at the Berry site is wonderful. They do fun work. It's really clever, modern science, all kinds of clever underground radar, all kinds of radioactive decay and dating, all kinds of wood analysis. They're good guys. They do good work, highly cited work, except that they really miss the big picture, you know, entirely. They don't really have any view. And of course, archaeology, you know, somebody once said archaeology is anthropology. It's nothing. You know, my feeling is archaeology is about telling the story of people who are gone. Oh, there's no point in doing that. That's my view. Yeah.
Do you know anything about the legend of the lost colony of Roanoke?
Not much. Lost colony of Roanoke, no. My opinion is they became Indians and were much happier. Yeah. Do you want to come and say something?
Yeah, well, the lost colony migrated from there to eastern Virginia, and they mingled in with the Pamunkey Indians. And matter of fact, when some of the English-speaking people finally came to that part of Virginia, they were surprised to learn that the Pamunkey could speak English, and they learned from the survivors of the. That's the story. That's the Indian side story. That's what I mentioned about. Jim, you mind telling me we're in the process of putting a museum in?
Yeah. Why don't you come up and say a few words? Yeah. This is my pleasure and my great privilege to introduce Chief Lee Vest of the Remnant Yuchi Nation.
Who was the person to ask about Southwest Virginia Museum? You, yeah, like we have been collecting artifacts for years. We don't dig them, but there's a lot of people that have donated stuff to us. We're putting a museum in Sullivan County, Tennessee. Of course, Saltville was our capital years and years ago, but now our primary location is in Kingsport. We want to put the museum there, but it's going to represent all of Yuchi. According to our tribal history, we had villages, towns, all the way down to the James River, Blacktop County, in Virginia. And then all the way across Southwest Virginia. A lot of people say there's a lot of Cherokee stuff here. We don't believe that. The museum in Nashville, Tennessee says the Cherokees didn't come to this part of the country until 1790. I wasn't around, so I don't really know, but I just do know that the Cherokees were not here. Our capital was Long Island in Kingsport. And the name of that island was called Tanasi, T-A-N-A-S-I. It's a Yuchi word. It means a confluence of streams. That little short word, a confluence of streams, is shortened down to a meeting place. Now, there's 3 Tanasis in Tennessee. There's one being in Kingsport, there's one in Memphis. We get back to what DeSoto, they were calling the Yuchis there, Chiska. We had about 17 different names that I know of. Yuchi is not our word. Yuchi is a Creek Indian word which means faraway people. So what happens when the Spanish comes through and the other people come through, you know, non-Indian people, they met this tribe, and of course they're looking for God. Well, who are those people over there? And so the language was Chiska, you know, the faraway people. So anyway, we had that contact in Memphis. There was a hotel down there named Hotel Chiska, and it had a lot of Indian logos. The key had an Indian with a war bonnet on, and I mean, can you imagine 1,000 years ago us putting a big feather headdress on and run through the rhododendron here and get jerked off? So we just wore feathers down. But anyway, the museum that we're having in Kingsport, I'll leave a business card if anybody's interested. We are looking for donations. We are a 501c3. Our museum is a 501c3, which means you can make a donation to us and it's tax deductible. So if y'all happen to have anything, we'd appreciate it. There is a pharmacist in Kingsport, Dave Berry, Berry's Pharmacist. He's donated a bunch of artifacts to us, a whole bunch of artifacts. We photographed all that stuff back in March, and Catherine and Philip needed a copy of that. One picture came out on a CD. We actually had 100 photographs. So anyway, if y'all happen to know, anybody wants to donate anything to us, the museum will include Southwest Virginia and East Tennessee. That's about all the artifacts that we're taking. That's all I've got to say about that.
Questions that you have?
Anybody have a question?
You mentioned Long Island. That was also the northernmost war camp of Dragon Canoe, wasn't it?
Dragon
Yeah,
Canoe,
he was Cherokee, I think, or
no, Dragon Canoe was Chickamauga,
was he?
which was an offshoot of the Cherokees. We were married with the Yuchi people. The Cherokee really never was up here. It was the Chickamauga people. And when I say up here, it's on the
This area.
history. This is our history. This is what we've been told. So Jim reads a lot of these other books. I very seldom will read books written by white authorities who have their own opinion. As a matter of fact, when Jim and I first met, it's been several years ago, I spoke at the Wolfhills Archaeological Society in Abingdon. And my talk there that day was about the Spanish coming through. And it was amazing, because I had never read the Spanish archives. I'd never met Jim Glanville before. And all that stuff, my granddad always told us, believe our people. And I guess he meant believe our people, don't believe in those stories. Because a lot of that stuff was misinterpreted and misunderstood. You know, they didn't know our customs and our history. So anyway, the story I told was about our people had gotten word that the Spanish was coming to this area, and we sent some warriors out. And after I got through, Jim came out of the audience and approached me. And the story that he knew about the Spanish and our people was almost verbatim. I mean, ours was not written down. Ours was passed orally. And we tell these stories at our tribal meetings, which we have every month. Tomorrow is one of our tribal meetings. We tell these stories over and over and over and over again, so our children can memorize those. We don't have a story that's written down at all. I mean, we still practice that tradition. But there's about 700 of us in our tribe here in this area. 700 enrolled members, but they're not all here. We've got people in the military, Afghanistan, wherever they happen to be. I've got one sister in California, one sister in Roanoke. I've got a brother in Kingsport. We've got people in Washington State, North Carolina, and Snowbird, like Jim was talking about. Matter of fact, there was the chief of the Snowbird people one time. His name was Running Horse Vest. I've never been able to find anything of him. My brother's got some records of that. But anyway, Long Island in Kingsport was our site. We've got some of the artifacts from Long Island in Kingsport that people have dug up and given to us. So, if you have any questions about that, I'll leave some business cards, or you can come up and see me, I'll give you a business card. So Jim, I appreciate Jim Glenn so much. He has done so much research on us, and we actually were unheard of, basically unheard of, and in history books were written. Tribes That Slumber is a good book to read. It's the top-selling book at the museum in Knoxville. Some of the artifacts that's in that book, we actually have those in our possession. Some of the archaeologists that made the dig over in Carter County, they have given us a lot of that stuff. My grandmother, when she was alive, she lived in Milligan College, right across, actually from the college there. And somebody gave her a whole bunch of artifacts a long, long time ago. So anyway, we want any artifacts from this area, Southwest Virginia, anyway, anywhere from Blythe County this way, and we eventually went all the way across the state of Tennessee. Anyway, Appreciate you.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming to this event. It was wonderful to have Dr. Glanville here. I recently heard about him, and I'm just amazed at the things he's discovered. So take a minute to go and ask him any questions you might have. You just get to ask.
We're going to hang around for a while if anybody wants to ask private.
Here's our master roll.
Yeah, this is the Yuchi Master Roll.